Hi, everyone. I wanted to, first of all, say hi to you, let you know that I continue to be thinking about you and praying for you. And I want to let you know that any questions that you have about this whole messy situation, in terms of what's due, when it's due, what's flexible, what's not, please fire those at me. Feel free to send me whatever emails you have, or get a hold of me on my cell phone number, which is available on the revised calendar. Feel free to text me. You can also reach out to me if you want to do a video chat on Hangouts. I would just say to be mindful of what you need to do. You know where you're at better than I do, and I think you probably have a sense of what you can handle and what you can't, depending on what your experience is right now. I am trying to figure out right now, of this material that we're going to be going over, what is available for you on the exam. So I don't think I'm going to be testing you on grief per se, except maybe the podcast, which I have assigned and would like for you to listen to. And that would be probably in an essay format. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the things on this particular lecture or anything like that. This is really more intended to be a resource for you, something that may help you get through things. And you know what? If it's not and you don't want to listen to it, shut it down. You don't have to hear it. But I'm hoping that this will be something that will be beneficial for you in the long run. So, I'm sitting here on my couch. You can see family pictures behind me, and I'm going to maximize this and see how things go. Okay, so let me kind of make myself a little bit smaller over here. Um, okay, so this particular lecture is going to be relatively short, but we're going to be talking about communicating about loss. And we're going to be going through a number of things about grief, really focusing on what is it, how do you recognize it, and how do you respond to it, both as the person who might be grieving and as a person supporting someone who's trying to grieve. So let's move in. Are we getting anything here? There we go. All right. So ultimately, in this process, what I'd like to do, like I said, is identify grief. What is it? How is it different from other emotions? Talk about how grief is different from the experience of shock. And I'd like to talk about tools for coping. Like, what do we have within some of the things we've already talked about? What communication tools overall do we have to cope with experiences of grief? And then we're going to go through some kind of do's and don'ts for people as they're communicating about grief. And this is all based on clinical research, it's based on communication research, and a number of other sources. So let's start with what grief is. So unfortunately, my slides are going to be a little bit blocked here by the webcam, which you probably don't even really need the webcam, but hi, maybe you want to see me. All right, so what is grief? We talked briefly about grief when we went through our section on emotion, and we talked about how emotions have levels and how if sadness is a core emotion, then grief is kind of further along the branch that sadness offers in this tree of emotional life. So grief is a profound experience of sadness, well past, our basic feelings of I saw when I was in Utah, I was standing talking to a friend, and a bird literally fell out of the sky and just fell onto the ground in front of me. And it was like, oh, that's sad. That's a normal kind of emotional response to something like that, but it's very superficial compared to what grief is. Importantly, a lot of us think of grief as something that we only experience after the death of a loved one. That's not necessarily true. And I think we touched on this in class as well, that grief is not always experienced after something. It can also be experienced in anticipation of something. And that something is a loss of any kind. So we can grieve losing a job. We can grieve losing an apartment in a fire. We can grieve of course, a family member or a friend who was taken from us unexpectedly or not unexpectedly. So, of course, we grieve grandparents when they die, even if they've been sick for an extended period of time. And so often what happens when someone has been sick, let's say, for a long period of time, that part of the grief experience happens prior to their death, to where you're mourning and you're hurting and you're in pain while you're waiting for that event to happen. And then when it happens, grief continues, but it changes form for some people. So importantly, not everyone knows that they are grieving or when they are grieving. A lot of people don't know how to talk about it. They don't really have kind of that emotional vocabulary that we've addressed. But also, we have a lot of other terms that kind of get conflated in with the experience of grief. Things like depression, or sadness, or just anger, or moving on, or whatever it is. Those are all potentially part of a grief experience. So we'll talk about how we can identify that in a moment. But I just wanted to say it's not always as obvious as we think it is. So this little picture here has, we want grief to be this very like straightforward, really obvious process, but it's really much more messy. It kind of moves and twists and turns, and it may not be what we expect it to be. Grief is, in this vein, a non-linear process, but it is importantly a process. It's not something that we just experience and are done with. It's something that we go through over a long period of time, and that varies for every single person. So we don't start at one point. It's not universal. Not everyone starts at one point and ends at another. Some people start in the middle and end up back at the beginning, and then toward the end, and they kind of move all over. So again, with this kind of squiggly line here, that's a good indication that grief is not what we think it is. So you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief, and I'm popping those up here on the slides. The first, okay, let me say something about the 5 stages of grief. This is a research that came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is a psychologist, and I think it emerged in the 70s or so. And she developed the research in talking about how patients who are terminally ill grieve. So not necessarily loved ones. The stages became extended to loved ones later on, but it wasn't necessarily. Let me see if I can make this a little bit more full screen. No, not going to happen. Okay. So it wasn't necessarily just for the people who had experienced loss. It was for initially the patient. And so you'll see some of that in here, but this particular approach has been largely critiqued over the years because it suggests that we go through these in order, and we don't. Many people don't. So I recognize that some of you right now are grieving. You're grieving because of Elena and her death. You're grieving because of the fires. You're grieving maybe something else entirely on top of these other things. But your experience is going to be really different than mine or than someone else's. So as you look at these stages, keep in mind that you can experience one or all of them, and they don't necessarily happen in order. So let's start with the idea of denial. This is generally also associated with the experience of shock, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But this is kind of the like, I can't believe this is happening. I don't know. He's, if it's, let's say, with an illness, oh, he's going to be fine. He's a fighter. He's going to overcome it, when maybe the evidence would suggest otherwise. Anger, of course, is exactly what it sounds like. It's just anger at the situation. Maybe it's anger at, I've experienced in the last few days a lot of anger at the idea of sin, the anger of mass shootings, gun laws, gun violence, stuff like that. I'm very, very angry about that. Bargaining is something that you're going to see more of in that terminal patient where they're kind of making deals with God, that it's like, okay, if you save my life, then I'll go to church every Sunday. But people who are recovering from a loss that aren't patients, for instance, can also do a little bit of bargaining. And it's kind of it's a control effort. It's a way of saying, okay, if I do this, then maybe something else will happen. So sometimes it's bargaining with God. Sometimes it's kind of bargaining with the self. It's a little bit more fuzzy. I can't say I know a whole lot about that stage, but it is commonly experienced. And again, I think this is one of those pieces that's a little bit better to understand for someone who's a patient. Um, the next stage, and again, this is not necessarily linear, is depression. So some people, let's say, might jump from denial to depression. Then they might go backwards to anger. Some people might jump straight from shock to acceptance, and that's just their process. So depression in this case is not referring to clinical depression. So it's really more referring to an emotional experience rather than the clinical experience, which also involves biology, things like not sleeping well, things like not having energy to do things. That may be part of it, but it's really more of like a short-term, circumstantially related depression rather than like a full-blown, long-term experience of depression. But in that same season, there might be a lot of reflection, a lot of really kind of internalizing, a lot of loneliness. And then the last stage is acceptance. And another way to put that would be reconstructing, kind of refiguring what life is going to look like, rebuilding parts of your life, whatever that may be, and hope, the experience of hope. So when you can finally return to a feeling of things are okay, there's good in the world, I can trust people, I'm safe, I am excited about what's coming next. That is the experience of hope. So again, some of you, if you're experiencing grief, you might be in shock right now, and within a week or two or less, you might be at that hope stage, at that acceptance stage. And that's okay. That's still grief. That's still the experience of grief. It's just one version of it. On the other hand, the events that have happened in the last week may affect some of you for quite some time, months and months, maybe years. And you might go through all of these stages. You might repeat some of them. So maybe you start in shock, you move to anger, you skip bargaining, go to depression, you go back to anger, you go into acceptance for a while, and then you slip back into anger. There's a lot of different ways that this can kind of happen. So I think it's important to note, though, that even in this little chart here, all of these little loops and swirls and twisty turny experiences are still moving forward. So I really want to make my video smaller so you can see that. But at the end of it there's a little, you can't see it, but there's a line that shows with an arrow moving forward that you do keep moving forward. So just something to note there. Okay. Let's see, I've got to get back in here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the experience of grief for the person who is grieving. For those of you who are feeling that right now, or for those of you who aren't, this is a little bit of what's going on for them. So let's talk first about shock. So as we were just saying, shock is an early stage of grief, but it is the natural first reaction to a trauma. And like grief, it's highly individualized. But some of the symptoms that are involved with that can include things like emotional numbness, where you just kind of don't feel anything. You feel like a blank slate. That's totally normal in the experience of shock. And shock, by the way, can be immediate, and it can last for several days and weeks even. I've had the opportunity in the last week, because I work with a nonprofit organization, I think I've mentioned it, Interface Children and Family Services. I work with them quite a bit on domestic violence and human trafficking issues, but they also have been responding to the shooting. And I have had the opportunity to go and meet with family members of people who lost their children and survivors as well. And we've been trying to get them resources so that they can get some of their immediate needs met. And one of the things that I've encountered has been numbness, just sort of moving through the world like there's no stimuli around them, like they're almost in a fog. That is a normal experience and may last for quite some time. Um, so that is part of shock. It is an early stage of grief and it is a normal reaction. In fact, an essential reaction to trauma. Detachment is another part of shock, and that's similar to numbness, but it's really more, it's a little bit different. Where numbness is kind of shutting down emotions, detachment says, I'm going to feel these, but separate from you. I can't be connected to other people right now. Sometimes also that detachment can be experienced physically, like where you physically detach and remove yourself from social contact. Shock can include flashbacks, it can include nightmares, triggers. So triggers would be, we throw the word trigger around a lot, but triggers actually in trauma is specifically referring to some type of stimulus that takes you back into the moment of the trauma, where you are there. You smell the smells, you hear the sounds, you feel everything that you felt at that time. So that is common for people who are in the shock moment as well as in other stages of grief. But yeah, okay. And then physically, people who are in shock often report feeling nauseous or nauseated, I should say, and weak, physically weak, fatigued. They experience a lot of anxiety, and that can be sometimes overwhelming. So let's look here at different symptoms of grief. So you'll notice here that shock is one of the symptoms. So it is part of grief, but it's also distinct from it in the sense that it's kind of a first wave. So again, note this is not an exhaustive list, and that one of these things on its own does not indicate grief. So if you know someone who has insomnia, that does not automatically mean that they're grieving, and you already know this. But on the other hand, if they have two or three of these things and they've recently experienced a serious trauma, that means that they are probably experiencing grief. So you'll see that there are physical symptoms, there's social symptoms, and there's emotional symptoms. And if you want to read through these carefully, go ahead and just pause the video and take a look at it. But some of the things that I would highlight in physical symptoms would be things like, of course, crying, but chronic fatigue. So just that feeling of like, I can't get out of bed, and the littlest things make me feel so exhausted. So sleeping, of course, goes along with that. Some people report physical pain, just aches and pains, digestive issues where a lot of people just have trouble with all manner of things. They can't keep food down. Um, yeah, appetite, eating, things like that can be really difficult. Social symptoms. Um, Often these are withdrawal symptoms. So remember those action tendencies that we talked about from emotion? So when you experience an emotion, your body has a natural tendency to say, I want to take care of this emotion. So with the action tendency for sadness, and then by extension grief, is withdrawal. And it's to go into your cave. Now, that doesn't mean that that's functional. It doesn't mean that that's the best thing for you. And most people who experience grief later report that they could have experienced grief in a way that was better for them on a personal, social, and physical level. So there are ways to grieve well. And one of them is to not withdraw. Obviously, it's normal and healthy to have some time alone to process and think, but that's very different than that excessive desire to be alone or to really, really dramatically remove yourself from your friendships, not talking to people. Or in this last one, the last note here under social, it says unusual instances of acting. Oops, sorry about that, of acting in high risk or acting out. Sorry, I need this little guy to go away. Acting out or engaging in high risk behavior. And high risk behavior would be things like drinking more than usual. It would be things like using various substances to kind of numb out or to check out if that's not normally your habit. Um, it may be basically an avoidance of the experience of grief. And I would suggest, even if maybe it is your regular habit, that you might want to consider if you're avoiding some emotions doing those things. Um, Emotional symptoms on this are really varied. So again, shock is part of it, annoyance and irritation. So a lot of people who are grieving get really irritable and snappy, and you might see that some when we come back to campus, or even now, that people are just kind of difficult to be around, and you may find that to be the case for yourself, and you don't understand where it's coming from, and you feel like you should be nicer to your friends or whatever. Give yourself some grace. That is a normal part of your body's heightened experience, and it's also just a normal part of processing really hard things. Um, Nightmares, trouble focusing or concentrating, worry, um, confusion, guilt. A lot of people experience guilt during grief. That is usually not, it is a fair emotion to feel, but it's not necessarily appropriate in the sense that it's very rare that people should feel guilt for their actions, especially with the kind of circumstances that we've been dealing with as a community. Okay, so if you are a person who's grieving, here's some of the things that you might want to consider avoiding or being careful with. So the first one would be what I'm calling shame-based posturing. These are behaviors that are born of really the need to feel like you're strong, to be competent, that you're not vulnerable and you can't be hurt, which is a normal protective response after you have been hurt. But if it continues for too long, it becomes counterproductive. If you want to know more about this, I highly recommend that you read some Brene Brown. She writes about vulnerability and shame quite a bit. So, some things that you can look out for in terms of your language. I'm fine. You're not fine. If you're experiencing grief, you're not fine, and you don't need to say that you are. If it makes other people uncomfortable for you to be honest and say, I'm having a hard time or I'm really struggling, um, then those aren't the people that you need to be talking to right now. And it's okay. You don't have to protect their feelings, just as they don't have to necessarily protect yours. So I shouldn't feel so badly. I should be grateful because I'm safe. I've heard myself say that this last week, where I've been struggling emotionally, and just out of compassion for you all, and then I've been almost guilty because my house is safe and my family is okay, and I feel like I should just be okay, right? But the reality is that we all feel pain in different ways and for different reasons, and that's okay. So that's something that you want to check, if you find yourself saying that. Reflect on it. Where's that coming from? Are you feeling grateful? Are you feeling sadness? Why? Is it an appropriate response to what you've gone through, etc.? Shame-based posturing can also be masking nonverbals, and I have to say this is one that Pepperdine students are seem to be uniquely gifted in. When you guys are struggling, you're very good at putting on that happy face, and I think that's not really productive. There are times and places, of course, right, where you need to keep it together and have some self-control, if you don't want to expose everything that you're going through to other people. But overall, masking nonverbals just means that you're putting on a mask and that you're not being authentically yourself, and in that you are not allowing people who would wish to love you the opportunity to love you. So other things would be, again, like I was saying, avoiding close others and deep conversations. If you find yourself doing that consistently, that's something that you need to pay attention to. Those are things that you actually need. um, and sometimes people avoid those deep conversations because they don't want to talk about their emotions. And that's okay to an extent. Not everyone is a verbal processor with that, but um, a lot of times people don't talk about their emotions because of a fear of losing control. This is especially common with men for some of the masculinity dynamics that we've talked about in class. But we stigmatize losing control. And I think by losing control, we usually mean, excessive crying or feeling like we're not socially performing the way we need to. And again, with grief, we want to have something to control. And so sometimes we feel like we are the thing that we can control. And that's, again, not necessarily healthy. And then this one, I've added in just as a caution. A lot of us use our phones for our primary mode of contact with our friends. And it's a great way to get support, especially when you're in all over the country and things like that. It's a great way to be in contact with each other and to text and say, I love you, hey, hope you're doing well, etc. But if you are grieving, actually physically need physical affection. You need to be touched, you need to be hugged. And the amount of that is going to vary by the personality, but it's really important that you get that. And so I would encourage you to get time with people that you love who are right near you right now. So things that you can do, communication habits that you can pursue in this season right now. The first thing I would say would be to feel free to talk about what's going on. Name your emotion, every single last one of them, whether it's anger or fury or sadness or guilt or whatever it is. Try and talk through that without judging it, because your emotion is just an emotion. It's not a defining characteristic. Silence, as we know, is powerful. And sometimes there aren't words to express what you're feeling. And so learning to be comfortable with that and sitting in that when you're talking to people is okay. A lot of the time, again, this is kind of related to that shame-based posturing. We have trouble letting people help us. We have trouble letting people come into our lives and do the things that we should be able to do for ourselves, or we think we should be able to do. And again, this is something that is counterproductive. A few years ago, I lost a baby, so I miscarried a baby, which is very common. It's about 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. And I was like, the statistician that I am, I'm like 1 in 5 pregnancies and I'm doing okay. And I can, like, it's fine. I'm going to get pregnant again. It's no big deal. I'd already had my son. So this was between my son and my daughter. And I didn't let anyone help me. I was just like, I'm fine. I'm moving on, whatever. And finally, one of my friends literally barged into my house and was like, sit down on the couch. I'm going to do your laundry and I'm making you dinner. And I'm like, you don't have to do this. This is so annoying. Don't make a big deal out of me. Like, I'm fine. I already have a child who I love and I'm so thankful. I know I can get pregnant, blah, blah, blah. And she kind of made me let her take care of me. And it was such a gift. It was such a gift. I'm so thankful that she pushed for that. So I hope that you can let other people do that. It gave me a time to just sit and to feel my feelings and not keep rushing through busyness, which is one of the things that I do to cope with my own difficulties. And it was big. There was just something in it that let me really feel loved. So I know it's easy to feel like you don't need help, but chances are you do right now, whether that's practical help or just or little things. It's still an important experience. And then I would encourage you to talk about the situation directly. So using euphemisms and things like that don't help you or anyone else understand the process. So rather than saying that a Pepperdine student passed away, it's generally considered better to say a first year student named Elena Housley was shot by a mass shooter. It's really hard to say out loud. And I, even saying it, worry about how you're going to hear that. but it puts truth and power into the event, and it helps people to wrap their head around what you're going through. It helps you to wrap your head around what you're going through. Um, if you knew, in this case, we're going to talk about Elena, but if you knew Elena, talk about her memories. If what you're grieving is your apartment, talk about your apartment. Talk about the things that were in there that you miss and that you aren't going to get back or whatever. That's okay. And it will help you in the long run deal with it, even though it may be more sensitive in the short term. And I would recommend for those of you who are grieving to be careful with who you choose right now. So you know your tribe, you know your people. But one of the things that's going to happen is a ton of people are going to reach out to you and they're going to want to hear that you're okay. And that's fine. They might be good friends, but they might not be the people for you right now. And it's not your job to maintain every relationship right now. So choose the people that you want to talk to, press into those, and let the other ones know kindly that you're just kind of getting your needs taken care of with your immediate family and closest friends right now, and they'll understand. Okay, so a few things that we've talked about in class that are potential tools for you to use in your grief experience. One is therapeutic writing. So if you remember, we did that activity in class where you wrote about something that was deeply stressing you out, and you wrote continuously for 15 minutes. I think the ideal is 20 minutes, but just writing about what you're feeling and why and where that's coming from, and doing that every day for about 4 days can be highly, highly valuable for processing your feelings. Of course, other forms of verbal processing besides writing can occur in conversation with people. And that, again, is something that's really valuable. Just talking it through, using, naming your emotions, describing what you're feeling, what went on, what happened, talking through those things to a point is valuable. Now, there's definitely points where we can ruminate and we can talk about it too much, and you have to figure that boundary out for yourself. Communal coping is something that we haven't talked about as much in class, but communal coping is the process of dealing with an issue as part of a community and really leaning on others to help you grieve. And one of the ways that that's commonly accomplished is working with other people in a similar situation toward a common goal. Sometimes that's honoring the deceased. It's coming up with a project or a memorial of some kind to honor the loss, whatever that loss might be. And then I would just largely recommend reading, learning about grief, learning about whatever it is that you're struggling with, whichever event, both events. Just read about it. You will feel less alone, which is part of why I assigned the C.S. Lewis reading to you on A Grief Observed, because it is him describing his experience of grief. And at least when I read that, it made me feel less alone in my various experiences of grief. A few other books that you might read. Oh, it looks like I didn't finish my list here. I started to, but Brene Brown, like I was saying, writes on the power of vulnerability. She has a number of really great books out there. C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed, and gosh, there are so many good grief books out there. Those are two of my favorites. Okay, so for those of you who might not be grieving but know people who are, which I would guess is all of us, or even if you might be both. You might be both grieving and in a position of having to support someone who is grieving. So let's talk through that. What not to say. We'll watch this little video in a second, but of course, using cliches and self-centered remarks like "I know how you feel" is not appropriate. You know how you felt. Maybe in a similar experience, or how you feel right now, but it's not necessarily the same as someone else. Let me know if you need help. I don't think I have ever heard anybody say, "Oh, actually, I could really use help with my laundry, and can you come and clean my apartment?" No one says that. People offer help and they expect other people to be able to accept that. Most of us, like I was saying before, do not know how to accept help very well. And so just saying, let me know is not enough. So instead, a way to do this would be something like, I would really like to help you. Can I come over on Wednesday? And maybe by then, can you think about some things that I can do for you? Um, and it might even be, even if you just want me to hang out. So something like that where it's much more specific. It does require a little bit more assertiveness and it's delicate, right? Someone might be like, no, I don't want you. And that's okay. But let me know if you need help is not an effective term. Things like it was God's will. Horse crap. It wasn't, and we'll talk about theology in a minute, but a lot of people experiencing grief are also questioning their faith. And the idea of divine plans is really hard to understand in times like this, and that's okay. So to say trite things like that does not provide the comfort that you might intend it to. And that would also go for things like they're in a better place. Um, you might believe that, and maybe even the person who's grieving believes that. But that's still a cliche and it's lost its meaning just as much as things like sending thoughts and prayers doesn't really bear a lot of weight. Most people don't take it real seriously. They think maybe you sent up a thought or a prayer rather than being consistent in praying for them. If you want to communicate, let's say that you're praying for someone, tell them how you're praying. Tell them what you're praying about. Tell them when you're praying. Share a verse. Share a particular thought that you're thinking for them. Be specific. That's generally considered more effective. Like I said, for the people who are experiencing grief, relying solely on technology for your communication with that person is not enough. So if you can, move from texting to FaceTime while you're apart, or make sure that when you get back to campus that you get time physically with that person and that you use more touch maybe than you normally would, that there is more hugging. And a lot of this is already natural to these types of circumstances, but it's not for all of you. So I would just encourage you to be intentional about offering what might be needed. So equally, you might have a close friend who's grieving, and let me just remind you, you cannot force them to put their confidence in you, to share, or for you to be their confidant. You cannot require that. That's self-centered, and it's saying, I want to be the one to help you because I want to feel important in some cases. And so you do have to kind of allow them to be where they're at and to share what they're going to share. Um, so I'm going to play this little video here that talks about empathy, that an empathic person is going to be sharing, is going to be more understanding than someone who's sympathetic. So empathy versus sympathy are distinct things. So let's watch this for a minute. Oh, is it not going to play? It's not playing. Oh, bummer. Okay, well, if you can find this, let's try it one more time. Yes, here we go. Okay.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down, I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Um, Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so I love that video. I think it's a really great depiction of, let's pause that, of some of the challenges with empathy. And I want to kind of talk through these other points here. So, oops. So we talked about for people who grieve, speaking directly about their experience and saying exactly what happened rather than using things like passed on or moved on to a better place. Those are okay things to say if that's really kind of how you understand and envision those things. But for many, many people who grieve, they prefer direct terms like death or she died or my house burned down or something like that. So being direct, being clear is generally considered to be a better thing. So similarly, as we talked about with people who are grieving, they are masking nonverbals in some cases. Someone who's supporting someone who grieves should not be trusting their nonverbals. That if they say, "Oh, I'm doing great," that you just go, "Oh, okay, good. You must be doing great." No, I would encourage you to kind of press those buttons a little bit more and be like, "Are you?" Okay. And if they, most likely they'll probably, if you probe a little bit, they'll say, well, I am doing okay. I am doing better, but it's still hard. And in that case, it helps you understand a little bit more of where they're at. So generally, with difficult things like that, you do have to ask more than once, and you can't just trust kind of their initial mask. And then finally, one thing to avoid here would be advice giving. So things like, oh, when I went through this, here's what I did, which I feel like I just did on the last slide, but it is actually research based for me to tell you that accepting help is a good thing. But let's say that I wasn't in this position and that was unsolicited advice. And I just kind of said, like, here's what you need to do. I think you need to go for a hike and go clear your mind. And then after that, go and get your toes done. And then you're going to feel better. Meh, yuck. Please don't do that. So what can you do? Listen, don't interrupt, ask questions. Listen again, don't interrupt, ask more questions. Get down into the pit with them and don't feel like you need to make it better. Don't feel like you need to add a silver lining. Just say, that sucks. This is horrible. I don't know what else to do or to say. I wish I could help. Things like that. Remember that silence is okay. Sometimes silence is a bonding and binding experience for you and another person. You can accept what they're feeling and you can affirm what the person who's grieving is feeling. It's okay to feel that way, no matter what their feeling is. You don't need to tell them you shouldn't feel guilty or you shouldn't feel angry. God is in control or things like that. Just say, it's okay to be mad at God. It is. You can help. That is a valuable way to show love. And as I said with my friend, sometimes just jumping in and saying, you know what? I know you don't think you need this, but no one likes to do their laundry, and I'd like to do it for you. You want their permission, so you don't want to be, totally in their business. But if this is someone close to you, you probably have the ability to find a way to help, even if you've been kind of brushed off for that. And so some ideas for that are simple. And sometimes, by the way, you can just go in and do this. Like, don't even ask, just let it be done as a gift. Things like laundry, cleaning, providing class notes, making a meal. Just bring a meal over. No one's going to be like, oh my gosh, how dare you bring me food? Grocery shopping, changing sheets, whatever it is. These are things that people who are grieving aren't thinking about. They're not thinking, when was the last time I changed my fitted sheet on my bed? That's just not crossing their mind. Sometimes even things like keeping up with bills can be really, really difficult. And I know for most of you, you've got parents who are helping you manage that, but not everyone does. So finding practical ways to help is going to be really valuable. Again, acknowledging the situation, being direct, and checking in for a long time. Um, when I went through my miscarriage, I kind of went straight from shock into acceptance. I handled it um, pretty well. And part of that was because I got pregnant with my daughter almost immediately after. Um, but I had a friend who checked in with me, I'd say probably every maybe 3 to 4 weeks for the first like 6 months, where she just kind of said, thinking about you, wondering how you're processing the miscarriage. And it meant so much to me to know that other people were still thinking about it too. She texted me on the first anniversary of the miscarriage. And I hadn't even thought about it. I hadn't even thought like, oh, this is the anniversary. But when it hit me was actually after my daughter was born. So when I was like postpartum and I was holding this just a few day old baby in my arms, and I was looking at her and loving her and feeling like, oh, there was another one. Oh my goodness. And it actually hit me, and I struggled for a few days with it. Um, and she was the person I knew I could call because she'd made it clear to me that she was still holding presence with me on that issue. So it doesn't take much. It's just a quick text to say, hey, thanks, or hey, I'm thinking of you, or a little note that you drop in the room, or a hug if you happen to see them, and just some words of, wondering how you're handling all of this. So keep that in mind for months to come. And even if it means that you have to set reminders for yourself on your calendar to check in with that person, do it. And then finally, be mindful of triggers that your friends might be experiencing. Let them mention it. You can't kind of tiptoe through your life just in case there might be something that's going to trigger a person. But be aware that there might be some and that you need to be able to respond to them. So, triggers can be anything from, like I was saying earlier, smells or sounds, but it can also be specific holidays. It can be dates on the calendar. It can be movies. It can be random things in their environment. When I lost my grandpa a long time ago, he died, gosh, I was probably like 19. And like a year later, I went to see The Notebook. It was in theaters at the time. And if you've seen the end of The Notebook, it involves some Alzheimer's and dementia issues. And my grandpa passed away from Alzheimer's. And I was watching this movie with a bunch of friends, and I felt fine. Like I'd accepted it. Grandpa had had a long road toward death. He had been sick for a long time, so it felt like in some ways a relief. But we're watching this movie, and there was a scene that just triggered a memory, and it was so powerful for me. It, like put me back in his nursing home, and I could like smell it, and it was crazy. And I just lost my mind and was crying and crying and crying and crying in this movie theater. My friends are going like, what is actually happening? And they didn't really know what to do except sit with me and let me cry. And that was good. It was all that needed, but you don't know when it's going to come up, and you don't know why or when, and you don't need to. You don't need to understand. It's not like it's a logical thing. So just be aware of them, be mindful, but don't feel like you need to walk on eggshells either. All right. So communication response tools for people who are responding to those who are grieving are basically the same thing. Therapeutic writing. Go through and process your emotions on this issue. You can talk about how it feels to be helping, because in helping someone with trauma, in some respects, you are stepping into that trauma with them. So again, process your emotions verbally in conversation, in addition to writing, but don't do it with the person that you're supporting unless they ask. It is not their job to take care of your emotions. It's just not. They may not have the capacity, but they might. So if they want to, you trust what they think they can handle, not what you think they can handle. Practicing self-control is going to be big with that. It just means that when you're listening to someone, that you're not letting your emotions go, and it doesn't mean you're not sharing. It doesn't mean you're not real and authentic, but it doesn't mean that you're, expecting them to comfort you because of what they just said to you is uncomfortable to you. And then again, communal coping. So participating in part of that idea of working together to honor whatever that loss has been for you. So I want to talk just briefly, kind of in summary, about how do we understand some of this from a Christian perspective. And this is a hard one, but I want to remind you of a few things. One is that the Bible teaches that Jesus was fully human and experienced the full range of human emotion, including grief. The shortest verse in the Bible is that first point there. Jesus wept. From John 11, this is the story of Jesus' friend Lazarus dying. And he gets to Lazarus' home late. Lazarus has already died, and Lazarus' sister Mary comes to Jesus and says, "Where were you? Why were you not here? You could have stopped this and you didn't." And Jesus saw her pain and he cried with her. And I believe that Jesus does that now, that he still mourns when we do, and that when we are in anguish and emotional pain, that he's in that with us. Similarly, traditional Christian doctrine would say that death and pain are not part of God's will. Now, there's a difference between God's will and God's plan. God's will is what was ordained at the start of human life. It was a state of perfection, a state of perfect communion with God that was uninterrupted by sin or death or pain. And that those things are products of sin. In other words, they're products of the work of the adversary or the enemy in our world. They are not from the heart of God. That is traditional Christian doctrine. Now, it doesn't make it any easier to digest that these things are in the world and that God doesn't stop them from happening. So God's will is for us to be in perfect communion with him. His plan is sometimes different from that. The Bible also says that what man intends for evil, God will use for his glory, for his good. And I don't know what that looks like right now. I don't know that you believe that. I struggle with it myself at times. But in terms of theology, that is what we're taught. What I have found a tremendous comfort in the last few weeks and in other seasons of my life has been the book of Psalms. The Psalms, as you know, most likely are a collection of poems and songs that are written for emotional experiences. And so I would encourage you that when you are doubting, you're suffering, that you can meditate with those who have already suffered, the people who have gone before you in the faith and talked through and thought through these things so that when you can't pray, when you don't have the words, you can use their words. And some of the Psalms that are helpful for that, in my experience, are 5, 12, 22, and 42. 22 in particular has a lot of anguish in it, and it rotates between the anguish that the writer feels and their sense, sort of this cognitive sense of the sovereignty of God. Um, several when we heard the news of the shooting, several of your colleagues and I were in Utah, as you know. Several of your colleagues, your professors, my colleagues, were in Utah, and we gathered together and we prayed Psalm 22 together, because we were just crushed with all of you. And um, I found, I don't know that I'd say comfort, but I found meaning in that. So I hope that you will as well, if you choose. So that's what I have for you today on grief. I appreciate you listening to this. I encourage you to reach out with any questions, do some more reading. I have other books that I can recommend for you if you want to do some processing. So have a wonderful day, y'all.